And also, Eve asked me to remind you that if you have dietary meals that you need to check with her at the registration desk. I want to welcome you all to the Governor's Conference in this section on Clean Water Act Section 404 permitting and mitigation issues. It's a discussion panel, and I'm very happy to welcome David Ross, the Assistant Administrator for Water, Mike Ricketts, who's the Chief of the Regulatory Division of the Corps in Louisville District, my colleague Mike Harden, who's the Assistant Director of Division of Fisheries and runs the in lieu fee program for the state of Kentucky, Nick Dilks, who is the Managing Partner at Ecosystems Investment Partners, and he's a mitigation banker, and Brian Miller, who's Executive Vice President of the Building Industry Association of Northern Kentucky. I'm Pete Goodman. I'm the Director of Division of Water, and I'm going to try to moderate this group. They're very strong-willed people. A lot of people don't know much about the Section 404 permit program, but it's fairly controversial. If I just say WOTUS to you, you've heard the controversy about that. It establishes a program to regulate the discharge of dredge or fill material into waters of the United States, and those activities include fill for development, water resources projects as dams and levees, infrastructure development, mining projects, etc. So that requires that you get a permit before you do the fill. Sometimes we have to remind people after the fact that permit's on the front end. And it requires, in some cases, compensatory mitigation, which is one of the big issues that make it somewhat controversial. I'm supposed to be changing slides here, I forgot. So the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in almost all states have jurisdiction, in part because of the old Section 10 rules under the Safe Harbors Act. And so the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers does the administrative day-to-day program, including individual and general permits, making jurisdictional determinations, developing policy and guidance, and doing enforcement. EPA plays a role of oversight in that regard and develops and interprets policy and guidance, determines the scope of geographic jurisdiction and applicability of exemptions, particularly agricultural exemptions are an issue for Kentucky. Approves and oversees state and tribal assumption of the 404 program under 404G. And it has the authority to deny, prohibit, or restrict any defined area as a disposal site under 404C and can elevate specific cases under 404Q. A general schematic of this is that if a developer plans a project, if it's a dam, if it's some kind of fill, commercial development, whatever, and there's a fill into the waters of the U.S. and the Corps makes the determination if there's no mitigation required, you're just going to proceed with the project. If there is mitigation required, you have to apply for the 404 permit. They calculate, the Corps verifies the mitigation units quantified, and then you can either go have the permit be responsible for the mitigation themselves, or you can buy mitigation credits from a bank or pay into the in lieu fee program. The activities requiring mitigation are when you have permanent loss of streams of fill from like highway construction, mining, dams, etc. Here's an example in Pike County in US 460 where they took the cut and then filled the valley with the cut. The mitigation options in the 2008 rule switched from permitting responsible mitigation as the priority to actually mitigation banks and then in lieu fee, and then permitting responsible mitigation being the order of priority based on recommendations from the National Research Council in 2001. That sort of flipped the status quo for the Corps, and I'll show you a slide a little bit later that Nick, I'll leave up for you later on to speak to. So the compensation of wetland losses requires sort of a balancing act. If you have units lost by the permit applicant, the compensatory mitigation requires that those units be replaced, and there's different mechanisms to do that. One mechanism is mitigation bank, where the mitigation bank, Nick, for instance, will come into the Corps and propose a mitigation bank for a service area. They'll do the mitigation, and they'll have these accumulated credits that they sell to developers, and then the permittee can create the impact. So they pay to play, sort of, in that regard. Or similarly, you have the impacts created as part of the permitted activity, and then the credits are paid to the in lieu fee program. There's a 20% charge on that on a temporal disruption issue, and then Mike's program will conduct mitigation via the in lieu fee program. Nice example in Knott County, in a headwater stream in Knott County, where you see a stream up against the side of a hill. It's maybe been straightened up there, and the bank cutting into it, and they moved it out into the middle of that valley and reconnected it to its floodplain and the subcutaneous groundwater, but I can't get started on that stuff. And then they put pool and riffle back in. So that's a much more highly functional stream on the right than it is on the left. And then a bigger project being a perennial stream in Bath County, where you can see that there's a lot of head cutting going on along some of those banks. So they're stabilizing those banks through various anchoring and starting to recreate pool and riffle and put that back to its natural contour and meander and reconnect it to the floodplain, vegetate it and stabilize those banks, and you end up at the end with a stream that looks like that. One of the best things and most beneficial things that can happen to a stream is really good mitigation, really good stream reconstruction. One of the issues that we've been talking to the Corps about is service areas, and this has to do with the predictability. If I have a service area, that I know I can sell my credits in a service area as a mitigation bank or as in apply service credits in an area, our position as the cabinet has been, why don't we make these service areas bigger? Because it's going to make mitigation more affordable, and it's going to expedite the permitting process, as well as provide predictability to get banks to come in and invest in mitigation in Kentucky. This is the slide I'll leave up for Nick, but as you can see on this slide, the blue is mitigation banks, the red, orange is, depending on if you're colorblind, is in Luffee, and then the green is applicant-driven mitigation. And as you can see, the trend toward in Luffee and mitigation banks over the past 6 to 8 years is really the mitigation banks are in Luffee are taking a much bigger proportion of this. In part, that's because in 2008, the rule changed from to make the preference mitigation banks and in Luffee over applicant-directed mitigation. But the other part of this, and Nick will speak to this a little more, if you look at the time in the lower right part of that slide, the time it takes to get a permit under mitigation or in lieu fee payment as opposed to self-directed mitigation is half. And time is money, and that's an affordability issue. One of the other aspects is permanent protection of areas that have been mitigated, and that's done through a couple of ways. You can do it through conservation easements or with deed restrictions on properties that have fee simple purchase. This is a deed restriction area on Salt Lick Stream in Bath County. This is a fee simple this is a conservation easement on in Bath County, and then this is a fee simple with deed restrictions in a project in the big farm stream project. The other challenge that we're seeing in the program is severed mineral rights. When they have when the mineral rights are severed from the surface rights, trying to maintain permanent protection, particularly for oil and gas. We're working with the Corps to try to find creative ways to move beyond that being an impasse, because it really does suppress the ability to put in mitigation banks and in lieu fee programs, particularly in eastern parts of the Kentucky, but not exclusively in eastern Kentucky. One of the ways is to look at the probability of those mineral rights being exercised, but also finding other creative ways to, because of directional drilling, et cetera, that there's a lot more potential to try to move forward with some control and assurance that even though we have severed mineral rights, we can be creative and put mitigation in those projects. So I want to welcome our guests, panelists, and I'm going to sit down and start questioning folks. I'm going to start with David. David, I was going to ask you that the mitigation, or the 404 program and the mitigation program is pretty controversial, and I think we identified earlier when you were speaking why it is it's about certainty, regulatory certainty, and I think you're working to try to clarify some of that.
Yeah, I am. Is this on? Oh, there we go. Hi. Yeah, well, actually, and even to dial it back just a little bit, why it's controversial is a little bit about sort of the emotional connection to the issue. So even the concept of the word wetland, you have wet and land in it, and you have this intersection between valuable aquatic resources, things that provide ecosystem services to our watersheds. On the other side, you have property, private property rights. And so as folks own land, have expectations and a bundle of rights, all those things that we talk about in this country, why this is a controversial area is because that transition from open water to dry land is sometimes not, we struggle with what that is. Even the Supreme Court, the smartest lawyers in this country have a hard time telling us what that transition really is. And so part of the controversy is just the pure emotional connection to the issue. But as far as the regulatory certainty, how to solve that, I do agree, that we can be better about providing clear rules of the game as to what is a federal jurisdictional water versus a state water. And by the way, that doesn't mean regulation versus no regulation. That just means federal regulation and the federal program versus state-led programs. And I believe that it's not the 1970s anymore. The states won't race to the bottom. I think the new econ theory out there is that states will fill, states will rise. And so, again, this isn't a conversation about regulation or not regulation. It's a conversation about who regulates and who is best regulating. And I think that the federal government can do a better job helping to lay down, where that line is.
So as you write the WOTUS rule and prepare that in phases going forward, what are sort of the principles you're relying on for jurisdictional determination?
The core legal principles and policy choices, and supplemented by what we know about the science. But at the end of the day, this is a conversation about what is our constitutional authority, what is our statutory authority that Congress has given the agencies, the Army Corps of Engineers and EPA. We can only exercise the power that Congress gives us. And so that's where I start. And maybe that I'm biased because I'm a lawyer, but I start at that rule of law, that bedrock principle, which is the federal government can only exercise the power it's given. The executive branch agencies only have that power. And so we'll start with the law. The statute has language. There was a specific word choice, that they use nation's waters to describe the holistic programs of the Clean Water Act. As we're talking about more of our regulatory programs, they chose to use the phrase navigable waters, and that is history has can provide some guidance as to what Congress meant. The Supreme Court in the Swank decision back in 2001, Justice Rehnquist told us that navigable waters was a word choice that linked this to commerce and the commerce powers of the United States. And so we begin with the Constitution, the statute. There are three major Supreme Court cases that give us some guide rails. Not perfect, but in 1985, the Riverside Bayview case gave us some guide rails about what we meant by adjacent wetlands. Swank gave us some guide rails as how we dealt with isolated waters and what the government could use to, well, not birds, the glancing goose test, migratory bird test, whether or not that was an appropriate power, and the Supreme Court said no. And then the Rapanos decision, while it's been controversial, there are, Justice Scalia and Justice Kennedy both wrote differing opinions, but there's commonality in those opinions that I think people have sort of missed. And so we're looking at trying to provide some, pull the principles out of those cases and to establish our test.
Mike, you guys are in the wonderful position of implementing two versions of the rule.
Sorry about
that. One in Indiana and Illinois, and the other in Kentucky. You're making jurisdictional determinations every day under two different rules in different states. That's tough, and then and of course the Corps comes under a lot of criticism because they have to do this program, which is difficult and complicated. I was going to ask you how on a day-to-day basis how people can improve the timeliness of permitting, the clarity of how they should move forward, what their mitigation obligations are, et cetera.
Sure. Well, regardless of these trying times with the court cases, I would say that it's always been this case, a decision that goes through in an expeditious manner. Usually, the greatest percent of the time usually is when an agent and applicant comes to us early and talks to us and gets us in the pre-application meeting, gets us on site visits. We have discussions ongoing too. So we still encourage applicants to do that with us. Come to us early. Don't come to us the 11th hour. You know, if you know that you want this project in, let's say, May of 2020, you know, don't wait till March of 2020. Come as soon as possible. It gives us a chance to work through the process with other agencies. If it goes an individual permit process, certainly it goes out for public interest review. But again, the key is just that sitting down and having that dialogue and understanding the wish of the applicant, and then helping him or her get through this process called the 404 process.
Are you under any internal increasing pressure or external pressure to be more timely in permitting under the new administration?
I can't say that there's a pressure. We've always had, the Corps has always had a business practice. Let's try to do better and quicker and more efficient. Certainly it is that way now. I can't say that it's a greater pressure. We are now currently looking at, we have these things called national performance measures where we're looking at, can we process a permit type of, whether it's a general permit or an individual permit, in a more expeditious manner. But again, as rules change and get more complicated, sometimes that's slowing us down also as well. So it's kind of a little bit of a slippery slope.
So you and I both issue lots of permits every year. What is your, we track them and we know what our timeliness is, and we try to find problems and improve on them. What do your numbers look like?
Well, I mentioned the national performance measure. So as the word national is, it's what our program tries to target across the country. There are 8 metrics. The 2 that are probably the most interesting to applicants is okay, Corps, how fast can you come to a decision? And the 2 that come to mind are for general permits, or some people know them as nationwide permits. And the other one is individual permits. So the target of the national performance measures for general permits, they say, okay, can you do 80%, at least 80% in 60 days or less? For FY18, the Louisville district as a whole actually did 93% in 60 days or less. So we exceeded it by 13%. That's just working smarter and harder, coming up with tools to help us as we talk about, you know, consistency and predictability. That's things that help us. The individual permits, the target is, can you do greater than 50% in 120 days or less? That's more high fruit, because as I mentioned, that's where we bring in the public interest review process. We coordinate with sister agencies, both state and federal, like your 401 agency. So, but nevertheless, we work efficiently at that, and for the FY18, we did I think it was right at 68% in less than 120 days.
So that's well above your goal.
For the individual permit. So one thing I did want to say too, is I mentioned about having dialogue with applicants. I use these 2 great examples. Before I came to Louisville about 16 months ago, I was in a field office on the lower Ohio River down towards Owensboro, and I worked extensively in the Illinois basin with the coal mines that are in that area. And the 2 companies that come to mind, they were just great to work with. One company mined in both Southwest Indiana and West Kentucky, and the other company mined exclusively in West Kentucky. And they came to us, and as they worked with us, we had very frank discussions at times. They brought points up to us that we agreed, like, okay, I think you're making a point. They've seen our points sometimes that they didn't want to see, but nevertheless, their decisions went off the runway just like a plane does on schedule. And it was great to see that. But then on the other end, it was kind of interesting, because the companies that maybe didn't want to work with us, or maybe wanted to be more obstinate on some things, scratched their heads, why are those 2 companies getting permits when we're not? Well, the key is that open dialogue and working with us. So that's 2 great examples there that have worked for a mom and pop or to the largest of companies. So.
I want to turn a little bit to mitigation. Mike, I'm going to start with you and ask you what you think are the biggest challenges in developing mitigation in the INLUFI program.
Mitigation, at least for providers like the FELO program, and I guess for mitigation banks too, really it's a construction project, and you go from the beginning of a construction project where you identify a property and plan for that, and then you try to secure the property, and then you go through the design, construction, and lastly the monitoring For us, the biggest challenge is in that property phase. We identify many more projects than we end up developing because of the troubles we experience in the property phase.
What are the specific troubles, like mineral rights and?
That's part of it. You know, when we have to have a clear title to make sure that we have the right to do a project there. And sometimes the titles have defects that we have to work through. There's a limit to how much we can cure those defects. But also the mineral part of that is a big issue. In Kentucky, the mineral rights have been severed in many cases, and sometimes up to 100 years ago. And there are countless unidentified heirs to that mineral, and trying to track that down is really nearly impossible to do. And because of that, a lot of times we end up walking away from that project. Now, I want to kind of qualify that. In most service areas, we can work around that, even though mineral may exist across the state, and you may have some different occurrences of mineral. But most service areas are okay, but except for the eastern portion of the state in the Big Sandy River Basin, which is a service area of ours, and then in the western Kentucky coal fields, those are mineral-rich regions, and you have a lot of mineral severances and issues, and that presents probably the biggest single challenge facing the program because of those severances, and it rules out the candidacy of mitigation sites, really.
Is that true, Nick, with you? Is that you have similar challenges for mitigation bank sites?
It is, and so folks know, I mean, the criteria for an in-lieu fee site or a mitigation bank site are the same, and they're consistent in terms of things like how predictably can you protect the site, and that's the issue you're raising, which is even if you restore the site and put a conservation easement on or a deed restriction, if the mineral owner is not subordinate to that, what's the concern that the agencies may have that there may be a future impact that would reverse that restoration. So that is a challenge that we face. We do mitigation banking across the country, so we work in, I think, 14 different Army Corps districts right now. We have 38 mitigation banks across the country. For better or for worse, each Corps district operates somewhat differently than the other. It's creates some flexibility, I would say, to really respond to local issues and needs. It also creates some unpredictability from district to district in terms of the standardization of things like service areas, which you talked about in your presentation. That's another challenge for us, just coming into geographies like this and having to understand what the criteria are for mitigation sites, locations. I have to give credit to Mike and his group. They really do. If you come in early and talk a lot and understand what their operating procedures are, you can learn that up front and be less challenged by making assumptions that are incorrect later down the road.
So the service area issue, I know we've been talking, as the cabinet, we've been talking about, I should say not just the cabinet, as pretty much the Kentucky agencies have all been talking to the Corps about maybe simplifying and enlarging the service areas, and I know that's something you're talking about. I just was curious, Nick, how that increased service area affects you, and then I wanted to get to Brian and say, how does service area play off economic development?
Well, I think one theme that you'll hear us come back to maybe in this panel a bit is how can we help worthy development projects go forward, and one thing is availability of mitigation, right? And so if there are more credits available, then there are more options for a permittee to obtain mitigation, or at least reduce the opportunity or the issue that there may not be any mitigation available. So larger service areas, or at least more predictable, standardized service areas, allows, whether it's us or FELO programs, or even the permittees, to know in advance where they're going to find their mitigation. If it's unpredictable, it makes that harder, or if the service areas are too small, you may not be able to find mitigation sites. And so I think there's some work going on, certainly here in Kentucky, and also nationally, to look at that and sort of standardize at least service areas so that we can frankly make more mitigation available, which I think is good for everybody.
Brian, we discussed briefly the other day this idea of because there's not that much available credit in the developments going on in northern Kentucky, which is fairly considerable with some fairly big projects, is largely speculative. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so first off, you had asked a question about the size of the service area. And as everybody sits here knows, The compensatory mitigation rule really doesn't name that. It doesn't identify what HUC unit you need to actually apply. So this is the world where economics and science and environmental care meet, which is normally gray. And so we have to operate in that gray space. But to give you an example, if we were to mitigate solely in our service area in northern Kentucky, which is South Ohio, the rest of the state doesn't want us, so we're mostly Boone, Kenton, and Campbell County, Sincatucky. The per acre land costs in some cases are somewhere between $50,000, $60,000 an acre. If we were to move just down to Owen County, I own a farm about 20 miles north of Frankfort. When I come down to see you, I stay there, Pete. And because we know what the land costs there, you're talking about $2,500 an acre. So when you look at some of the other service areas around the state, quite frankly, there's very little economic development going on in the majority of it. So you have very little opportunity to positively impact streams and wetlands in these areas because there's not much money there, right? There's a considerable amount of fees going towards the urbanized areas in the Golden Triangle, Northern Kentucky, Lexington, and Louisville. Louisville being pretty good, but quite frankly, Northern Kentucky is the largest impacted from the business community. I think in 10 years, the private business community's probably put northwards over $9 million. Louisville's around 6.4, and I think Lexington's around 3.8 if you look at the record keeping. And I think those numbers are correct. So, we also look at the streams that are in our service area, and they're pretty degraded. We've got a lot of impacts that are there. And I know in a little bit we're going to talk about out-of-kind mitigation, but we have some ideas too about how we can do things, pay for sins of the past with money of today and in the coming years.
Oh, David, that's an issue that we've talked a little bit about, Mike, about this out of kind mitigation. And as you heard the service area and the mineral rights. Are we talking about updating the 2008 rule, and are some of these, do you suspect, will be addressed in any updates?
Well, yeah, in fact, I will tell you that this administration is very interested in creating more flexibility in this process. EPA and the Army Corps senior leadership talk virtually every day about ways that we can work together to solve, create better market mechanisms, create better, getting money flowing where we need it to go, focusing on the high quality mitigation versus, less quality. And one example is in Alaska, where the mitigation world is a bit different and the size of the landscape is different. The Corps and EPA just worked on a policy to create more flexibility in Alaska. And there are a couple of regulatory guidance letters that are coming out of the Corps now on trying to enhance the way we look at stream restoration by reducing some of the impediments for taking out dams and things like that allow stream flow. And so there's a very significant interest right now. There's actually a committee that meets, coordinated by the White House, that talks about these specific issues on a regular basis. And so, yes, the 2008 rule is on the regulatory agenda. Actually, the Corps of Engineer.
Is it on your heart attack list?
I just added it. Because actually the Corps is taking the lead in a lot of this. And so they've identified some modernization that I think, and I thought, there was a really lot of emotional concern about the 2008 rule when it happened. And you showed us the stat. When you flip the way we think about mitigation, the 2008 rule was a valuable enhancement to the way we restore ecosystems in this country. Great development. And there may be some opportunities to do some modernization. The way we run, IRTs, the way we look at, the service area. I think there's a lot of flexibility. And so, yeah, the EPA will be working with the Corps as we go through it to try to find ways to enhance, get another, it's a decade, so another level of enhancement, I think, in the mitigation context.
So, I liked your comment is that we're not in the 1970s and states aren't going to race to the basement. That there's an expectation by the public that we're in a different era, and if they give them flexibility, they're not just going to abandon principles. Yeah. And you talked a little bit about the effectiveness of restoration. And one of the things that I talked to our leadership about early on is why is the preference for mitigation banks and in lieu fee better than applicant-directed mitigation? And that's because they're not very good at it, and it takes a lot more time, and it's probably more expensive in the long run. But I want to, Nick, you know, the graphic we showed earlier about the uptick in mitigation bank, use of mitigation banks as opposed to applicant or permittee-directed mitigation. What do you think the dynamics are there? Is it just timeliness of permits, or are there other things at play?
I think it's a number of things. I think time to permit is a huge benefit. If you think about it, because mitigation banks, we're doing the restoration with private capital in advance of any specific known impact. So we're building stream restoration, we're hiring local people to go do it, but we bank or sort of stockpile those credits so that when a permittee gets through the process with the Corps, and the Corps says, okay, we're going to go ahead and allow you to impact these streams or fill this wetland, if to get their mitigation, all they have to do is buy it off our shelf, which we can do that in an afternoon. There's no more time associated with getting that permit. If they then have to say, okay, we've got our permit, but now I've got to work with the Corps to approve a permittee responsible mitigation plan, that's where that time lag typically comes in, because they're not only negotiating and working with the impact, but also trying to design a mitigation plan. But there are other features too. I mean, I think more and more sophisticated permittees are realizing that it's a hassle for them. Again, a pipeline company or the highway department, restoring wetlands and streams is not their core capacity. That's all we do. That's all Mike Harden's group does. So we're just specialized in it. We typically do it, you know, at hopefully at a very high quality, but we can take that hassle off them. We also, one of the nice features of buying a mitigation credit or an in lieu fee credit is, as a permittee, once you buy that credit, your liability as the permittee for the future performance of the restoration is extinguished. You don't have any responsibility or liability to have to monitor, maintain, or protect that site.
You're putting the risk on the private sector.
Exactly. Put it on the people that do this for a living, right? We're happy to accept that responsibility. Mike's happy to accept that responsibility.
Are you happy, Mike?
So maybe, I'm not going to speak for you.
So Brian,
I think
I'm
of
sorry.
it as just a division of labor, right? It's becoming clear as to what each group's role is, and more, I think permittees who are smart are saying, I don't want to be both the developer and the restorer. I'm happy to outsource that, and if the price is right and I don't have to worry with the hassle and I can get my permit faster, that's good.
Timeliness, Brian, a little bit on timeliness. Your members, I think, are pretty sensitive to timeliness in terms of the availability of projects and properties to be able to do what they need to do in an economic development time frame.
We deal with developers that are looking to come into Northern Kentucky on a speculative basis, and unfortunately, we've earned ourselves a reputation that, compared to other parts of the country, Northern Kentucky is a very difficult place to pay for what you have to do. Timeliness is a part of it. You know, we're in support of as many private mitigation banks coming into the state as possible. Competition drives the cost down. When I spoke at the Nationwide Mitigation Ecosystem Bankers Conference in Louisville this summer, I talked to the mitigation bankers in the room. They really liked the idea of a $485 credit. They didn't like the idea of going through a lengthy process, and I'm glad to hear that the work's being done in order to try to cinch these times up. But it's not just for, take a large industrial site, a manufacturer, it's not just how fast that permit's issued, but it's when that permit's issued. Because I'll give you an example. Bosch Industries up by CVG, our airport, was building on a third part of their parcel. Obviously, the first two parts of the parcel were probably the easiest ones to navigate through, the least amount of impacts. This is the last portion. So it was just a 180,000 square foot building with a parking lot that probably holds about 20, 30 cars. The overall fees that they had to pay between stream, wetlands, and ESA totaled $900,000 for a 180,000 square foot building. And quite frankly, if Bosch had to pay that moving in to our market, they would have never come to Northern Kentucky as an option to set up shop. The second thing that happened is because when the permit was issued, a manufacturer is in the business of moving quick, moving product, making it roll off the assembly line and selling it. They don't care whether that's March, they don't care whether that's February. And what it did, it put the land development process into wintertime development, and it resulted in another $380,000 in lime drying. So a 180,000 square foot building had over a $1.2 million impact to the developer and then to the customer. And they are absolutely livid about it. And they are talking to their counterparts in the industrial world. This is a serious issue right now. CVG, and people really don't know how much the airport actually owns all this property around there. The other issue is available credits, Pete. I know that Mike's got, 100,000 credits, advanced credits. Again, advanced credits are on a speculative basis. They're not tied to an individual project. So we're trying to throw our best dart at a board and think that we've got the price nailed down right. But when this goes through an RT, Mike, that may change differently. I mean, we've seen an issue right now, with the exception of your bank. We really only have 2 sizable banks in our part, which is the State Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources and Northern Kentucky University. NKU's got 30,000 credits. Amazon just came through, Mike, and you said they are being issued 73,000 credits. NKU's got 1 project just over the line in Boone County and Gallatin County. It's going to be 2,000 credits. And with all this airport property, we're going to run out of credits here really, really quick. And again, almost all of these credits are not based on an actual project. So we're kind of throwing darts at the board, hoping that we actually hit it. But if the IRT looks at this thing and we have misidentified streams, the price tag on the actual project may absolutely skyrocket to the point where we who are already losing manufacturing opportunities are getting into the world of having low-paying jobs come in because of the Amazon project. Logistic company after logistic company after logistic company is moving there because they are there to actually sort, pack, and move goods at $16 an hour. And so it's going to cause a downward economic pressure because we're going to be the center of Kentucky for really, really low-paying jobs. Now, thank goodness we're going to get a lot of them, but they're going to be not good-paying jobs.
So the challenge for an area like Northern Kentucky is available credits, and we've talked a lot about severed mineral rights and service areas. Mike, do you think the letters that are coming out, those what did you call them, David? Regals?
Regulatory guidance letters.
Regulatory guidance
He's the core guy, I'm just EPA guy.
Do they help you make more, do they give you more flexibility in making some of those determinations?
The one regal that just came out does give some flexibility. It basically says, what credits can you give for removing dams? So you're giving credits for basically bringing back the true functional aspects of a stream versus an impoundment. So yes, there will be some flexibility there. To the length of it, I'm not for sure yet until it really gets, deeper into it and how we take a more, I guess, open look at this. But I think there is some things there that will help us with. So I did want to say one thing too when we were talking about banks and in lieu fees, which this is something that really hit the radar probably 15 or 20 years ago, but banks and in lieu fees do help tremendously reduce what's called a temporal lag. That's really important to folks that really want to try to, really minimize that impacts the aquatic resource. So if it's like a permittee responsible, if they start the process, what is that length of time till we see that we have success? Well, that length of time is greater, whereas mentioned with the banks and the in lieu fee, those projects are on the ground running, and that temporal lag is really reduced significantly, which brings us up to, again, a truly functioning aquatic resource, much quicker time frame. So that is one of the pluses.
Our view, the cabinet's view has sort of been, if you take a longer view of mitigation and provide more flexibility, that those gaps that we talk about, the temporal gaps and actually the spatial gaps get filled in because you're facilitating mitigation. And sort of that's our sort of theory going forward, is that it's not as important to think about project by project and bank by bank, to have a more open mind, because that over time will heal itself. Do you see the regulatory framework changing enough to make this, to expedite some of these issues?
Well, I hope so. That would be the goal. And I think we're willing to fail trying. But I also want to talk more holistically about not just about mitigation, offsetting a particular project impact, but we're looking at holistically in the Office of Water and working with the Corps is looking at other market mechanisms to try to deal with things like credit stacking. So you're dealing, the federal government historically has taken the position that if it's a wetland mitigation credit, you can't have a species credit on top of it, and I don't agree with that. Or we're looking in the nutrient space, trying to find creative ways to bring money in to use constructed wetlands to treat ag runoff to help our water quality issues, and trying to incentivize the bankers to work with the farmers to help solve the nutrient issue. And so looking at nutrient credits plus the mitigation credits. And I'm also talking about how do we have drinking water systems that need to spend money to treat water treatment based on upstream algae issues, and can I wheel money from them out into the landscape to create, additional market mechanisms to provide more mitigation out.
So
where
that
it
goes into
matters.
that out-of-kind sort of, and that's really out-of-kind.
It's out of kind, and it's also, stormwater to drinking water to wastewater systems to nutrient management to offsetting wetlands development impacts. The conversation is how can we get all those different markets to actually coordinate with each other? And so it's tough. It's a heavy lift. And part of it is just we think about these things in silos, and we can't. My job is to try to kick down those silos. And so this isn't just about particular wetlands mitigation. It's about how do we create more market mechanisms to get more money flowing in to where the developers need it. Whether or not that's looking at the scale, I think that's important. I think, can we streamline the IRT process to get mitigation banks up and running quicker? Can we think about the way we sequence mitigation credits and release them so that you can deal with the economic uncertainty of the investment credit on how do I get money flowing in before so I can actually get the bank built? It's a construction project, right? You need equity. You need to get them up and running. So can we take a look at the way we sequence? All of that. It's an all of the above strategy that we're looking at. Do you do it through individual regals? Do you do it through an update to the 2008 rule? Do you deal with it in other water programs, integrated planning with municipalities? I think the answer is yes to all of those, and trying to grapple with it to lay down a framework so that, after folks like I move on, this isn't next year or 2 years from now, it's how do we change the market 5, 10, 15 years from now? And those are the things that we're looking at doing.
Now, those are the kinds of things that sound like, Nick, that would attract more investors in what you do. That you could stack some of those credits and merge some of those silos.
Yeah, the opportunity to hopefully use what's been a mostly good model, always needs improvement, but the 404 mitigation model I think really has been the foundation for a good system where the private sector can come in and hopefully deliver large-scale mitigation at high quality in advance of the impact. Something you mentioned was water quality. That's now happening in a lot of other places where I'm from in Maryland, obviously Chesapeake Bay has a lot of water quality issues. Counties and other jurisdictions, highway departments are allowed now to meet their water quality offset requirements by buying credits from, again, projects that do things like stream restoration, pay farmers actually to help restore their streams and do streamside buffers. And so you get, again, another notion of built on the 404 idea, which is people can achieve offsets by doing restoration. And they can pay landowners so they get that benefit. Instead of maybe regulating a farmer, you actually pay the farmer. And so I think you're seeing these markets growing as we, the private sector, can deliver on that, as permittees recognize they can get a better deal and have available credits through that system. And I think the regulators are, I'm not going to speak for you all, but increasingly happy with the outcome of that, that type of mitigation activity. So,
Mike, you may benefit from that in terms of you have accumulated a lot of credits because, as Brian said, there's some speculation there, and that puts some pressure on you to get those credits out on the ground in a finite time period. Have you availed yourself of the private sector mitigation credits by putting in lieu fee credits out for bid or anything like that as of yet? And shifting that risk to the private sector?
Right. We haven't purchased mitigation credits from a bank yet. And really, to do that, it would require permission from the Corps. The Corps has historically looked at that as two different forms of mitigation. But we do have that ability to do that, and in our agreement with the Corps, they recognize that we can do that. And I think that's been looked at as kind of a last resort if the in lieu fee program is getting kind of our money's getting long in the tooth, so to speak, and having trouble getting on the ground, and that is certainly an option. But we are looking at another option, and we're looking at a turnkey type of contracting approach. And I know this is an approach that has been used in North Carolina for some time, where we can hire vendors or companies like a mitigation bank, if you will, and they can go find the site and do everything, and we just pay on a per credit basis. So we're just now starting to look at that, but that has occurred in other parts of the country, and I don't know if David or Mike are familiar with maybe how North Carolina has done that. But.
I'm not myself.
Well, we're probably running short on time. I'm going to ask each of you what's your next big need to make stuff go forward.
A bourbon?
That's what I think you might have a consensus with the room.
Good. For this particular kind, well, I mean, the one thing I guess I'm going to put a plug in because we haven't talked about it, but it just, the other area that we're spending some time really thinking about enhancing sort of the way we look at the 404 program and mitigation is trying to encourage states to take the 404 program from the Corps. But back in the run up to the 77 amendments to the Clean Water Act, Congress was very clear that they had every expectation that the states would take the 404 program like the states took the 402 program. Right now we have 47 states that have the 402 program and only 2, Michigan and New Jersey, that have the 404 program. And some of there are financial impediments to it. The federal funding doesn't necessarily come with the state assumption like it does with the 402, but states are becoming to be more comfortable with payment, fee-based permitting programs, and I think there are a lot of states that are looking at that. Mr. James of the Army Corps, the Assistant Secretary of the Army, just issued a memo that sort of took out one of the major impediments for why states haven't taken it. So, the Corps historically has looked at what waters a state could assume, and it was a very narrow set versus what the Corps would retain as a big set. And if you're a state looking at setting up FTEs and going to the legislature and asking for money to run this program, and you only get 25% of the waters instead of 75, 80, 90%, there's not really much incentive to go after it. And so, Mr. James, I think really helped eliminate one of the major impediments for states taking the program, and we are seeing immediate interest. We've got lots of calls from states to go after it. And so we're going through a regulatory modernization effort for our 404G state assumption regs. We're working with states right now to try to encourage them. And again, for me, it's about getting resource decisions made by people who know the resources best. And in the wetland space and the watershed management space, I think it's the states. We've got very mature regulatory programs now in the states, and I think we can rely on them. And then at that point, you get streamlining, cost savings, administrative efficiencies. The federal government will still have an oversight role, but you really do speed up the permitting process if you can just have folks go on a one-stop shop. And so it's a major initiative.
One stop, you're getting 401 and 404 at the same point.
Exactly. Well, right now it's 404. You got the 401. You may have some state-based programs where you have to get a state permit in addition to the 404 permit.
Like Florida.
Like Florida. Like actually a lot of states.
Okay.
And so there is trying this whether or not there's a NEPA handle anymore. Mm-hmm. Once if the state issued permit, you don't go through the NEPA process. So there are a lot of reasons why I think folks are interested in it. And so we're looking at trying to actually realize the intent of Congress and encourage states to do it. It's a heavy lift, but we're interested in it.
Mike, Indiana's thinking about it. I talked to Commissioner Piggott last week about that, and you work with Indiana. How are you working with them on that?
Well, it started last fall. It started out with just basic, crunching numbers for them from our database. To give them an idea just how many permits, what type of permits, the impacts. It has evolved now to where we talk to them every other month on conference calls. We give them other information to think about, such as, training your staff. Also, too, it's not just the permitting side, but if you assume the program, about compliance and enforcement issues, things like that. We've brought that up with them. It's been good so far. Again, my duty is to give them the information, all that I can, and everything I can help them put on their thinking hat to where they make the decision. So also too, one of the things we did that was, I think, beneficial to the state is we gave them access to our project managers, and they went into at least one of our field offices, probably getting ready to go into another field office and say, what does your project manager do in evaluating a 404 permit application? And my understanding was from other components of the state of Indiana, once they did that, it's like, wow, we never knew there was that much detail into that. So it's giving them as much information as possible to help them go forward with their decision. So I think it's been good, and we're always open to help them or any state.
I'm going to tee one up for Mike. What's your ideal in lieu fee project look like?
Well, we've always kind of had this dream of tackling one of our most troubled watersheds. And, you know, we have watersheds in Kentucky, and some of them have multiple sources of impairment. And when they have water quality types of impairment, it makes it hard for the in lieu fee program to step in and do a project there. There are sustainability questions and issues. But the in lieu fee program has a tremendous amount of financial resources to try to tackle that. So it'd be nice to work with multiple partners and leverage our funding and work together and make that money, stretch that money out to tackle a big problem. You know, some of the impairments are acid drainage or organic enrichment and other non-point sources.
Or old dams we don't need to fix
Or old dams.
anymore, right?
And so I'd like to see projects where multiple partners can come in and really walk away with something we can be proud of.
Nick, I think there's a consensus, more banks is better. What do you need for that to happen? What do you think needs to change so that can happen?
You know, I think a theme we heard in the previous panels talks is regulatory certainty is really important for both permittees. It's also important for the banking industry. I think the more we have certainty around things like service area, like crediting methodology, how many credits you get for a mile of stream restoration, that sort of thing, that's always been one of the biggest impediments for us to either expand our own activity or frankly let others like us come into a market. You know, investors who help to fund these projects, and we fund, again, mitigation with our own capital or investors' capital, regulatory uncertainty is always the thing that makes them nervous. How are you not going to have a change happen, or if you make an investment in a large property, how do you know how many credits you're going to get or what service area you're going to get? If we can have consistency on that, not only within a core district, but even across the country, that's the big dream, then investment dollars will flow, companies like us will come, will create credits because we have predictability about the ability to then see them used. So,
I imagine you have, Brian, I imagine you have similar sort of parallel desires there.
Our members and they're all running construction projects. And you had asked earlier, kind of what's the big issue, what's the big want out of this whole thing? You know, clarity, expediency, or accuracy with timing. But the third thing is we have great interest in our region with regards to out-of-kind mitigation. Our sanitary district has got a $2 billion consent decree, and it's the same amount of dollars going to that consent decree as going into the Louisville Metro consent decree, while we're only just a fraction of that overall ratepayer base. So, you know, we haven't been here for all the conference sessions today, but I have seen previous conference sessions, and I know we need to address failing infrastructure. We have aging infrastructure. We have CSOs and SSOs in our area that have to be taken care of, and it's not right for us to be releasing raw human waste on the ground. It is a horrible thing. We've attacked about 50 out of 145 sewer overflows in our area, but at the same time too, the political structure with regards to what the ratepayers are willing to pay out of their pocket for their monthly services is a highly political charged item in our area, given the fact that we've got a regional entity who has board appointments from judge executives in the other counties. So there's a lot of political pressure to keep rates low, but we have to spend $2 billion in order to clean this up because that's what the courts have issued us, and quite frankly, it's just the right thing for us to do. So economic growth is wonderful as an opportunity, and yeah, there's a lot of things that can be cleared up with time, accuracy, and clarity. But economic growth only happens with three things: roads, sewers, and water. And if there is not the ability for a sanitation district to be able to fix their sewer overflows and maintain, repair, and replace their existing failing systems, there sure is not enough money to actually lay new sewer extension lines. And without new sewer extension lines, there are no new ratepayers. And if there are no new ratepayers paying into the system, installing brand new systems into the ground, which have very low I&I, which have very low failures, which are made out of the most technologically advanced products that there are today, there's not a growing top-line revenue for that district. So over time, the entire system will fail if there's not new ratepayers in. It's why electric utilities go running after new ratepayers. But unfortunately, sanitation districts are under a political target, and the fight is, and the argument is, to keep rates extremely low, while at the same time you have to fix everything in the system. And even if I'm a homeowner or a business owner, I want you to fix the stuff that I actually own too. So if we could do out-of-kind mitigation and take an immediate bite out of that environmental harm of putting human waste on the ground in 95 remaining locations in our area, we think it should be done. The last portion of out-of-kind mitigation is that we've had extreme amount of growth around the state of Kentucky in the urbanized areas during times where we didn't have the best technology, we didn't have the best BMPs. So we have big basins that are sitting out there that were never designed to treat water. They were designed to take water from the public right of way and hold it for a period of time and then throw it down a hill, and it goes into a creek, and you end up with hydro modification. Look at the amount of creeks that could be impacted to the better if we could take some of that money and retrofit those existing systems that have been operating for 40 and 50 years, but have them work in a new and better way.
That's well said. It's a big issue for us that we're working on. And I appreciate the panel's time, and I've learned a bunch. I hope the people in the audience have learned a bunch. I want to thank the panel for coming in today, and let's go to the bar, right? You all good? Thank you. Did we do okay?